All right, today we're going to have a bit of a debate on a topic that has been on my mind lately. I'm always thinking about the context of, the contemporary classroom experience and the demands on math teachers. And one thing that I've been wondering lately is sometimes I hear statements that maybe suggest that it's almost like this all or nothing type response to some of the research that's out there. So, we hear something like flexible grouping or, random groupings. And sometimes we lean into that idea and almost take it to where it's like, that's the only type of grouping that's going to exist within my classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to talk through, when that grouping makes sense, but also kind of push back and challenge the idea of that, like there's some situations where we do have to group students based on their ability or a particular skill we're targeting. So that's going to be kind of our debate today, no judgment. It's just kind of a
no judgment.
I'm going to judge. I'm going to judge.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know what, Yvette, I'm so happy like this topic came to you and you presented this topic as something we should dig into. And I think it's really important that we do dig into it because, John and I have chatted at length in earlier episodes of the podcast about some of our own, missteps along the way. And I think, I want to start and frame it here that as we're on this journey, it's really hard to find the balance and it's really hard for us to recognize when we'll call it like FOMOing into something, right? Like the idea is like, I want to be all in because this thing, it's like you can see maybe anecdotally that things are working well. And I vividly remember this at multiple stages in my journey where it was like I was all in on 3-act math tasks. It was like every single day, 3-act math task. And, I was all in on random grouping and vertical non-permanent surface. It was like every single day, we're going to do random, vertical, non-permanent surface. It was like everything. And it was trying to evolve. Now, here's the interesting part is like when we do this process, we typically go all in on something. Then we recognize that it's like not perfect. So then we look for the next thing. But the problem is sometimes we sort of forget and then we do it again. And I'm really curious here to sort of get your thinking as to like what brought this on, what brought this idea up for you to bring it forward for us to really dig in here, because we really want to make sure that we don't, sometimes when we say something, how it's interpreted is like thou must or thou shalt always do X, Y, or Z, and thou shalt never do these other things, right? So tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing and like what's inspiring us to kind of dig into this today, and we'll take it from there because I think there's one that's really on your mind here today.
Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of background for any of our elementary educators listening. We know that, here in North America, we've been on this science of reading journey over the past few years and really transforming literacy instruction. And I'm just going to describe something to you that's true in literacy. And I wonder if we can like make connections to the math classroom. So in the literacy classroom, the research suggests that when you're engaging in high level comprehension type tasks, so you're building vocabulary, you're building background knowledge, you're learning about language structures. The recommendation is that when you're engaging in those cognitively demanding tasks, the group should be heterogeneous. It should be mixed abilities. Everybody can contribute or bring their own experience to that environment. But when you are targeting foundational skills in reading, that should be differentiated. I'm going to find where every child is along their learning trajectory, and I'm going to target the skills that they need at that time to move them forward. And some students may have already closed that scope and sequence, and they don't need that targeted instruction anymore. Like they're beyond it. They're already fluent. But I might have another student who's really early in that journey. And so the recommendation in the literacy classroom is that, we're flexible. So there's times where we're all together. Everybody should be engaged in that learning. Everybody should be having access to that learning because it's that critical thinking, cognitively demanding, rich task. But when it comes down to foundational skill development, we need to be differentiated and we need to target specific groups with specific skills. So maybe that's where this thinking started for me, where it's like I see a lot of parallels in the math classroom, where it's like when we're engaging in a rich task, a cognitively demanding task, that's a time where it's like we should have visibly random groups. We should allow access for all. We should be valuing thinking from everybody. Everybody can bring their own background and experience to that task.
Mm-hmm.
But is there also a time in the math classroom where we need to be targeting remediation and foundational skills for students, where it needs to be differentiated, it needs to be specific, it needs to be based on their developmental entry point along a, let's say a number sense trajectory?
And I think what you're trying to bring up here is that when we think about grouping in math class specifically, you're thinking like if I believe in random grouping and I believe in heterogeneous grouping is essential for learning math, am I allowed to like go down and have say specialized grouping and grouping for students of skill level? And I think it's like we and goes to your point at the beginning, is like we think in absolutes. It's like either I'm this type of teacher or I'm this type of teacher. And if I believe that random grouping is great for learning, then I can't believe that, say, homogeneous grouping at any time is good for learning. And I think this is, and we've talked about this, like Kyle said on the podcast, about balance. And Yvette, you and I talked about this not too long ago, about this idea of strongly held beliefs, but loosely held. And saying like, strongly believe in random grouping, but I'm going to loosely hold them because sometimes it makes sense to go over here and do this. And I think where, and this was true for me, and I think what Kyle, you were saying is kind of saying like, we've changed as you grow. As long as you have those those strongly held beliefs loosely held, you have the flexibility to change your thinking, you change your practice. And this is how we get better as educators, is you constantly morph and adapt and learn what works and what doesn't. But I think what happens in math education from our experience, and this happens a lot, especially as we're trying to, shift into ambitious teaching of mathematics, is that we get this like identity. We strongly hold these identities in our math class of saying, I'm this type of teacher, I'm not this type of teacher, and therefore you can't do anything that other type of teacher may do, even though it may benefit students at one point. So when I reflect back on, say, my experience, I remember being like, having that identity, saying like what you said, Kyle, like I'm going to teach this way. I'm going to have a building thinking classroom where I'm going to randomize groups every single day. And we're going to get up and we're going to do some form of thinking task. And we're going to, have our 5 practices for orchestrating productive mathematical discussions type lesson. But when it came down to it, like I would say like that, if someone asked me what I'm doing in my class, I would say that. But then if I reflect honestly, there are days and points along that, even in that lesson, where you might be pulling 2 kids, 3 kids to the side specifically to address, say, this 2-step equation that you knew that they needed more assistance on, which is exactly like a homogeneous grouping of ability when those kids over there are, say, continuing this portion of the lesson. Like I was, say, doing that, but still held this like identity that I wasn't doing that. And I think we just have to kind of like accept that there are moves to be made in our classrooms that are the best for students. We just have to be able to be flexible and make the right move for the kids, and not just like say it's always this way or it's always this way. Because and this is the last point I want to make here, is like, it's the same thing as a teacher who's going to be like, I'm going to teach by the script every day and I don't waver from the script. The same is true if I'm like, I'm teaching ambitiously, but I don't waver from this pathway that I feel like I'm on.
Yeah, like I think too, like if we think about the belief idea and, the loosely held idea, it's almost like, more or less, it's like shifting our beliefs to understand and believe that there are times and places where certain things make a ton of sense, and there's other times where maybe they don't. And I think if we think more along those lines, what you'll recognize is you go, I guess that makes sense. Like if we truly believe that like every student in our classroom has various skills and abilities, and, they have different assets that they're bringing with them. They have different things that maybe aren't quite there yet, that aren't developed yet, right? Or that they struggle with. And at the end of the day, for us to think that one approach will work always for all students at all times with every single topic that we need to do, that is really short-sighted. I think, again, I'm putting me out here because I'm telling you that this was something that I didn't recognize along the way. And really, if we're able to find the balance between what will be helpful, because there is the side of it where, and we're going to take random grouping, for example. There are so many benefits for doing some random grouping. Keyword is some. But there's also so many negatives that could happen if we sort of leave it to chance. And what I mean by this is, like, when I randomly put students together, there's a ton of great things that happen. There's a ton of engagement. There's a ton of learning that's taking place. But what about the handful of students that aren't quite clear on something? Are we just going to leave it to chance? It's all going to kind of work out. It's all going to come out in the wash. And I think this is where we then have to go, okay. And I think this is where, Yvette's going to kind of take this idea with the idea of targeting, where there are going to be some students who are like exactly where we want them to be, but there's probably a lot of other students that aren't quite there yet, and that we don't want to just do more random grouping to hope it irons itself out on its own, because the reality is, in most cases, it's probably not going to iron itself out if we're being very intentional.
I had a conversation recently. I was coaching a teacher who's currently in the classroom. And, just to describe the context a little bit, this is a combined junior classroom. So we already have, an age range of students in the room. There are students in this class who would be identified, let's say, on a gifted IEP. So they're working above grade level. There are students who are on a modified IEP. So, based on their psychological assessment and their educational assessment, they're working below grade level. And there's also multi-language learners with a range of language experience from, no prior schooling to further along the developmental trajectory for language acquisition. So a diverse population. And, one teacher, 25 students, trying to make this impactful and equitable for all students. And so I'm going to share with our community the advice I gave to this teacher. And I'm going to preface this with, this is just my own current belief right now. I always say, like John said, don't hold me to it, because as I learn more, my thinking will evolve. But right now, my suggestion is, can you create space within the week where students are engaged in cognitively demanding, curious tasks where they can enter where they enter, and there are a variety of ways to solve that problem, and students' thinking can be honored in different ways. And the purpose of those tasks is to promote critical thinking, to promote problem solving, to promote communication, where it's really just about being thinkers and digging in. And the risk is, if we believe in all ability grouping, then we're saying that all students aren't capable of engaging in that task, which is not true, right? We have to honor the ability and recognize that all of our students are capable, and they're going to bring to that experience what they know.
Right.
And that might be through one-to-one counting. That might be just bringing an idea to the group, but we want to honor the fact that all students are capable of contributing to our math community when we're trying to solve an interesting task. So maybe that's happening, twice a week, where they're doing this really interesting cognitively demanding task, maybe 3 times a week, depending on how much time you have for math. But then there also needs to be opportunities where students are working independently to, practice or build on their understanding, where I can provide targeted instruction that aligns with what students need at that time. And so in order to, if we think about a trajectory for students, we recognize that there's going to be gaps. If our goal is to close those gaps or to help every student get as close as they can to achieving grade level standards or expectations, some students are going to need more intensive remediation. And that can, for all different reasons, maybe there's been disruptions to learning, maybe they've, experienced trauma, whatever it is. There are some students who are going to need a more targeted small group intervention where it's like all hands on deck. Because we're trying to make up gaps in learning for those students so that they can access grade level standards. And so for me, what that looks like is, maybe on at the end of the block or every other day. Students are working in centers, students are doing purposeful practice while I'm pulling my targeted small groups. And again, like those targeted small groups don't need to stay the same all year long. I need to be moving students in and out of those groups based on what they need. But I think that you kind of mentioned this already, John, like if all we're doing are low floor, high ceiling tasks where everybody's entering wherever they're entering, how do I move the kid who's still relying on one-to-one counting along the, multiplication continuum to algebraic thinking if I'm not giving them more intensive support to recognize that they're going to need maybe more reps, more practice, more explanation. They're not where their peers are right now in that skill.
And they get lost in the shuffle. And this is where you get a student who, if they're not getting what they need, and because that's what you're saying is you identifying as a teacher what your students need and being able to position yourself to give them what they need when they need it, and recognizing what students, which is differentiated instruction, is just saying I'm going to be watching, and I'm going to be planning, and I'm going to be structuring different experiences to help meet the needs of the students that I have in my room. Because like we chatted about the idea of thinking fast and slow, like the two sides of our brain. We often related that as well to, say, having extroverts and introverts, and playing from providing experiences that benefit students who need that quiet think time, and then provides experiences for students who are like, I thrive in environments where I'm social and I'm providing to the community. And not everyone was like that. So it's like going, again, it's all or nothing, right? It's like one is the other, but it's like, no, it's a balance. It's like, you can't plan for standing at the boards every single day, all day in group work, if you're not meeting the needs of that student who's like, I actually just need time on my own to internalize the thinking and the learning that we've just had here. And if you're not structuring for that, you're leaving that student out, on whatever they need. So it's even just that their consolidation, let alone that you recognize that student over there needs maybe that, but also the fact that they might need, say, extra practice. And I have to make sure I'm planning for that. We do have to consider all of these things. And really the big idea here that you're saying is like just being able to recognize what students need and structure your day and your week, or say your blocks or your unit around making sure we're providing all those supports for the students that you have in your room.
So I guess, I think that's kind of summed it up. It's like this idea of, and I think that we risk this in education all the time, not just in math, where, they talk about the pendulum swing, or they talk about this kind of all or nothing approach, which is, problematic on both sides of this debate. So now let's talk about maybe just a couple suggestions for what this could look like, as far as how do you identify students who might benefit from targeted support. So imagine like you're going into a unit, you have these cognitively demanding and rich tasks already planned, but you want to be able to identify who needs what and how to strategically group them so that you can provide the right instruction. So what does that look like for a teacher if they're thinking to themselves, you're right, I'm doing too much of this or too much of that. I'm doing too much grouping, or I'm doing too much random grouping, and I'm not providing targeted instruction. So what would be maybe a strategy we could propose for our listeners to ensure that they're gathering this information to make informed decisions about how they maximize their instructional time this block?
Well, I've got two thoughts that come to mind. One is a little bit more like during the process. So if, let's say, you're using random grouping or students are engaging in a rich task, instead of only focusing on, and again, this was me, I remember this, is like I was always thinking of like, what's the next question I can ask the group to keep them going? That was like where I was hyper focusing my attention. I should also be thinking about like which student in this group is maybe not quite with the rest of the group right now based on what they're saying. So I'm actually using formative assessment in order for me to try to identify like who is maybe on my radar here. Now, when you walk into a group, the reality is that if you've been working with these students for any significant amount of time, you might already have a general idea based on where students have shown their understanding to be previously, that you might want to be asking those students some specific questions so that you can really understand, are they understanding what's happening here, or are they doing a really good job of head nodding and sort of going along with, the conversation that's happening here. So that's one. But then the second part, which is something that is really easy to miss, is that when students are done working in those groups, we should be giving them an opportunity to go and do something independent. So if I'm looking for a specific big idea that we're after, a skill that we want to see emerge here, right? We want to know, understand, and do. What can students know, or what do they know? What do they understand, and what can they do? What's the question I'm going to ask students to work on independently so that I can then monitor as they're working on that task and really start to see who is getting the concept and who maybe understood that one problem, but maybe they missed the big idea, right? Like I can get an answer to a question and feel really good about it. But if I'm not picking up on the behavior that I'm after, the fact that this idea could be applied in other scenarios, that's a really important piece here. It's not just about solving really cognitively demanding tasks. It's about what was that task picked for in order to help the students know, understand, and do, and how many students, or where are the different levels of students in the classroom right now, so I can start in my mind thinking about, okay, what does purposeful practice look like tomorrow? And while they're working on purposeful practice, who might I be pulling strategically in smaller groups so that we can actually get to their actual pebble in their learner's shoe?
So I love the suggestions for that, dynamic assessment, formative assessment that's happening during the task. I also am a big fan of diagnostics. I think they are underutilized in the math classroom, and I'm going to, present maybe like 2 reasons that a diagnostic is helpful. So imagine you're going into a new unit and you give the diagnostic and you actually gather the evidence that most of your students already have solidified this learning. That gives you the indication that maybe you don't need to spend as much time on it, or maybe the 10 days you had planned can be consolidated into 5 because your students are already demonstrating mastery of those skills, whatever it is. What if you do the diagnostic and you realize like there's an entire group of your entire class is not ready for this learning, and it's like you need to kind of pull back a little bit and build up the background knowledge that they're going to need to access. But it's also super helpful for being proactive in identifying like who could already answer these questions before you even taught a single lesson. Like who's already ready to be, differentiated in that way. But then also like, are there students in your room who do not have access? Like it's like they cannot independently demonstrate an entry point, because those students should already be on my radar. Like I should already be coming up with a plan. I should be working with stakeholders. I should be identifying additional supports to kind of lift that student up before we get into the mix of it and their confidence is already impacted. So, and I'm going to cautiously say this. I don't think that diagnostics should be used to track students or stream students. That's certainly not what I'm saying. I think all students should have the opportunity to engage in cognitively demanding tasks and enter where they enter, which is our job then to make our tasks low floor, high ceiling. At least, once a week, twice a week, all students in mixed ability grouping should be engaging in rich mathematics, cognitively demanding mathematics. But what I am suggesting is like, how can we collect information about our students, our learners? And like, I would always say like, my favorite type of diagnostic is an interview. It's going to tell you way more than a paper pencil diagnostic will ever tell you. I always quote Marilyn Burns, and I say this all the time. I saw one of her talks and she said, the only time you can see a child's mathematical soul is when you sit with them one-on-one. But it's like, if there is a way that at the beginning of a unit, you can capture where students are entering and already anticipate where their gaps might be, you can be far more strategic in putting the appropriate supports in place rather than being reactive. When you're halfway through a unit, now you're scrambling. Like you have that information up front.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and this is what you just said is tied exactly to what Kyle said, because both of you were basically saying, I need to have a clear picture of like what my look fors and what my learning goals are for, say, this lesson or this unit or this series of lessons, and saying like, I'm going to structure that I'm going to be, my lessons and my interactions in my one-on-one time or my small group time, but I'm looking to see where students are on this set of standards. And I know that it was helpful for me when I shifted my, I guess, assessment techniques to be more standards oriented than, say, unit or module oriented, where I was doing unit tests and quizzes. It was like, no, I'm going to be looking specifically to capture and record or monitor where students are on these learning goals, which are standards, and we can then use those to help structure the learning or the next steps for those students. But up front, you have to know what it is you're looking for, so that you can then decide, today I am going to be going over, like what you said, Kyle. It's like you've been keeping in the back of your mind that interaction at that group today made you go like, I got to go talk to Kyle after, because or on the Thursday when we're going to be doing our our assessment growth work, then I'm going to get over there and make sure that I give attention to that kind of that standard that I noted for that particular student. And I think that's an important move that we have to make, is to like, what is it that we're looking to see from students? Like you said, know, understand, and do, but we have to have that clear picture ourselves. And it's easier if you have, say, already shifted your assessment tracking to be looking for standards and capturing the progress on the standards, because then you can easily be creating those look fors, and it's just going to happen naturally in the way that you're doing things.
I think, when I listen to everything we're saying here, the word we haven't used a ton, but I think is really critical, is this idea behind intentionality, the things that we are doing and why we're doing them. And that comes from both the math perspective, the actual content perspective, but then also the pedagogical approach that we're using as well at that time. And it's really a bit of this ebb and flow, right? Back and forth, and really trying to use the strategies that make the most sense at that time based on what we know. And then really trying to think of like, what's the goal here? And the goal is we want to help every student get a little bit better every single day. And really, like, if that is our number one goal, then it makes things a whole lot easier, because the reality is we know if we do too much of any one thing without really thinking it through, without really monitoring it, without really trying to figure out where students are before, during, and after they're doing it, then we're just leaving everything up to chance, And at the end of the day, it's like, it's great to see a student who's normally disengaged, being engaged in a problem solving process. Like, that's a win for that student. Absolutely. Behaviorally, that's a win, but it might not be a mathematical win. Like, it might not be a content win for that student to just be engaged in the problem solving process, but still not really get any sort of meat and potatoes out of the mathematics itself. So it's all about, I think, that awareness. It's all about, kind of knowing what it is that we're aiming to do here, and really just recognizing that at the end of the day, it's going to take more than one approach for us to do this really well. And, again, I wish that dawned on me, 10 years, 15 years ago, when I was engaging in these different processes. And what I recognize is, what? There's no baby out with the bathwater. It's all about taking what's working and trying to figure out where do these apply best for you and your students at that time.
I think that's our call to action today. It's like being cautious of, getting very extreme. And I'll go back to what John said about, to believe in something really strongly, but loosely at the same time. And I think that's like a caution for all of us in education. And at the end of the day, like, what really matters, and I think, Kyle, you just said this, like, what matters is that we understand the learning that we're hoping to support, but we also know our learners. And we also see all of our learners as being capable. And so we're giving opportunities for all students to interact, while simultaneously identifying ways that we can differentiate our support to meet their needs and help them be successful.
When I think about the 6 components of our classroom tree or the mathematics tree that we're trying to strengthen and build, our talk today reminds me specifically of the two being, say, the soil, the water, the sunlight, is having the mindset in the idea of like what we're trying to do in mathematics. I feel like that is the way I view the soil, water, the sunlight, which is, we usually say mindset and beliefs, but it's this belief about what we're doing in our math classrooms. And if we believe that what we're doing in our math classrooms is providing those rich experiences that everyone can engage in, then it will influence the other part of the tree, which is the second one I wanted to bring up, which is the branches, which is like, what are we doing? Like, these are our teaching moves that we have to have that pedagogical understanding, pedagogical knowledge, so that we make the right move in the right time. But it's strongly influenced, say, by our beliefs and our current vision for the way we want our mathematics classrooms and our lessons to unveil. So those two are the really important components I think we're pulling from this conversation. If you are unsure about all 6 components of the math classroom tree that we often refer here, you can head on over to makemathmoments.com/grow. That's makemathmoments.com/grow. You can fill out our quick assessment. It will help pinpoint. It'll share all 6 components, but it'll also pinpoint which of those 6 that you may want to focus in on starting, now, if you are starting to grow your tree. So head on over to makemathmoments.com/grow.